So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay, this being the additional one that we're going to do as a result of the landslide that the last one was that I unwittingly engaged in. But yes, we're going to be seeing something which isn't tied to any sort of theme. We are going to be seeing the Dominion of Gaurhoth team up with the House of Feanor, who we've already seen a little bit of in this little series of Silmarillion videos we're doing, going up against the House of Fingolfin. So it's going to be Feanor against Fingolfin, which should be an interesting matchup. Fingolfin maybe a little bit more about finesse and damage, Feanor a little bit more about armour and that sort of thing, and cavalry of course. Whereas over here we're going to be seeing the Falathrim take on Gaurhoth. Gaurhoth with a chance of redemption after their very poor showing in the last replay that we saw, and they should have the ability to do so. They've got plenty going for them after all, not least all of these wargs. And I suppose we will start here, considering it is just a flat 2v2. So yeah, Tundra Fox this time playing as the Dominion of Gaurhoth. We're seeing the Hishbut Hunters once again. Very entry-level force of archers, but it's better than having nothing. I mean, in terms of trading back and forth, we mentioned how Gaurhoth actually could have the long-range advantage over the Dwarves in the last battle, which they never really saw come to anything. That's not going to be the case against the Falathrim, you'd imagine. Archer to archer, Gaurhoth will probably struggle pretty heavily against them. They do have some detachments on the front as well, so at least investing a decent amount into their archers, so it'll be interesting to see how the opening engagements occur. Banked up there. Hishbut Howlers, again, they weren't really able to show what they're all about in the last battle replay either, mainly because Gaurhoth got stomped into the dirt so quickly that we didn't really see the benefit of these guys on the front line, really just digging deep and doing a decent amount of damage for the low tier of unit that they are. And again, against the lighter units that the Falathrim have, they should actually be able to manifest that reasonably well enough. We've got a full line of them as well. Yeah, Hishbut Howlers on both extremes of the line also. The Gijik Skaraz Zagulaklab, they're the heavy unit of more melee-oriented anti-cavalry cavalry units that Gaurhoth have. So I mean, the Falathrim do have cavalry of their own, and the Gijak Skaraz will be looking to try and engage with them, the heavily rusted aesthetic that they have. The heavier class of units in general are the Gijak Skaraz. Meanwhile, over here we do have Sauron himself with his little attendant. Sauron, of course, we didn't really get to see Sauron do much of anything in the last battle either, so hopefully we'll get to see him at least maraud around among the Falathrim lines a little bit more so than previously. Another unit of the Gijak Skaraz, we have some of the Hishbut Zagulaklab as well, the Javelin Cavalry, which again can be used in multiple ways. On pitch battles like this, Javelin Cavalry against Infantry tends to not be able to do damage quickly enough. They are far better against cavalry on the open field, but they are still a multifaceted unit, but they are pretty fragile, as we saw in the last replay as well. Interesting to see how that plays out. Scarahai Blood Drinkers, Armour Piercing, the more entry-level Armour Piercing unit that Gaurhoth have. Surprisingly vicious charge on them. But one thing worth mentioning is it's really going to depend on which units they engage of the Falathrim, whether they're going to be efficient or not. They'll be efficient against the higher-end Noldor units, which do have armour, but of course the Falathrim do have that split between the lightly armoured units and the heavily armoured units that they have in their faction, so should be effective nonetheless. More cavalry out here on the flank as well. 3 units of the Gijak Skaraz is a pretty big investment, 2 units of the Hishbut, and then way out here on the flank we have the Vorbak Gadjutar, which are a unit which can hide anywhere. We saw them very briefly in the last battle replay, but if they reveal themselves, they've got a pretty vicious charge on them as well. So that'll be the plan. Presumably the battles go along for a little bit of time and then have them come forward. Interesting as well to see 2 artillery pieces here. 2 mangonels. They're manned by Ironshod Legionnaires. So I think the only example of a faction that gains access to another faction's unit through artillery. But the mangonel is manned by Ironshod Legionaries, which are a decent unit of line infantry, honestly. Probably the best front-line force, most efficient front-line force that Gaurhoth seems to have brought. Again, considering the lack of Gijak Skaraz on foot, so we'll see. Some of the same weaknesses as last time in that army composition, actually a relatively lightweight front line, but they've got far more of an opportunity to try and force the hand of the Falathrim a little bit. Their allies today, the House of Feanor, who we've already seen once before recently. We've got the footmen of Hrin, who on that occasion were the most effective Feanor units, though kind of like the Gaurhoth in the last battle replay, though not quite to the same extent. Feanor really got given a good seeing to by Angband, so a good opportunity for them to try and redeem themselves against their fellow elves as well. I do like the look of the footmen of Himring, and they have got a pretty stiff task ahead of them, considering Fingolfin have got strengths in some of the same areas. It'll be interesting to see who comes out on top there. Shield Bearers of Halavorn. I don't know about the cavalry force that Fingolfin may or may not have brought. I mean, these human auxiliary units, both Feanor and Fingolfin have got human auxiliary units, though Fingolfin probably have a more comprehensive and stronger, I would say, core of that. The Shield Bearers of Halavorn are fine, and they're a very dependable unit of spears, but I don't know if they're necessarily going to be that good in melee against most of what Fingolfin have. So they're just going to be here in support of some of the other units. One area in which Feanor should be able to really establish themselves is on horseback. Mounted Company of Himring, more javelin cavalry, much like we saw from the Hishtwook Kraz from their allies today. A couple of units of them, so they're going to be looking to clear the way for some of the other units back here. 2 units of the Hunts of Caligorn, so it's kind of non-negotiable this time around that Alexios needs to use his cavalry to its fullest, because if he doesn't, Fingolfin will win with how much he's invested into this. Hunts of Caligorn, very strong off the charge, of course. And then we also have the Roqueni and Magloro looking resplendent. They'll be really, really dominant against pretty much anything on horseback that either of the opposing 2 factions have brought. There's very few units of cavalry in the game that could hope to defeat them in such combat. 2 units of them. A unit which was pretty disappointing in Feanor's last showing, obviously, with the Accursed of Alqualonde. Yes, they were utterly overrun, but they didn't do enough damage against those Angband units for my liking, so a good opportunity for them as well to redeem themselves against strong opponents in Fingolfin. And finally, the Otorn Mightymo, the highest tier of infantry units that the House of Feanor have. Very defensive. Obviously, they're going to be able to outlast a good deal of damage. Pretty armour focused though, so we'll see if Fingolfin have got any of their armour-piercing tools on hand. So here we go then, with a unit of cavalry first and foremost, the Arqueni Findicano. Been quite a while since we've seen them. An armour-piercing archer on horseback. I mean, they're a very strong unit actually, cavalry to cavalry, and the fact that they can outrange the javelin cavalry of Feanor might be a bit of a problem for them, but the sheer amount of Feanor cavalry means that their movement across the field is surely going to be hindered. Captain Gervais playing as them. Over here we have the Dragon Guard of Dorlomin throwing axes. Considering the lower amount of investment that Feanor have put into their army today, just a few volleys from the Dragon Guard could be enough to really blow that line apart. Potential dangers there. The Fyrdsmen of Dorlomin, that's an Anglo-Saxon word, I think. But yes, standard spears, very similar actually to the Shield Bearers of Halavorn. I have no idea which of the 2 is stronger. If I had to guess, I might go for the Halavorn Shield Bearers, just because I think perhaps the Fyrdsmen are more of a militia spear. There are more of them. Shield Bearers, again, numbers for this kind of unit probably make them just a little bit more well-rounded. Herdsmen of Hithlum are in here as well. This is a good combination of standard archer and then axemen in melee. Armour piercing always going to find its home against Feanor. Whether or not the quality of the herdsmen in melee is going to be enough to deal with stuff like the footmen of Himring, we'll have to wait and see. Sentries of Hithlum at the centre of things here as well. Pikes, as we've mentioned previously on these battle replays, are very rare. The Sentries of Hithlum are probably the most basic unit of pikes that the game has to offer, but even basic pikes can be extremely useful, as we've said several times before, and especially when many opponents are not going to have access to any of them. Right at the centre of this line as well, we have the Armatar of Barad Ithel. They're going to be here as a sort of bolstering force for the humans, increasing that morale and trying to convince them not to flee. Again, cavalry is the most likely vector for mass routing, and with all those pikes, I don't think that's too much of a problem. A detachment of the Fyrdsmen of Dorlomin in front of this unit of Dragon Guard, so over on this side they had to save a bit of money and go for the half-strength version. This, however, is going to be a very scary unit for anyone to face off against. The Sons of Hrin, huge amounts of damage, bodyguard tier stuff, probably the most impressive singular unit of humans that Silmarillion has to offer, and with that huge amount of armour-piercing damage, it's not really a huge amount that Feanor's infantry is going to be able to do to be the domineering force here. It is going to come down to their cavalry. Interesting to see a catapult as well. The Bladesmen of Barad Ithel are what is usually a fairly typical line infantry unit for Fingolfin. They're going to be trying to coax once again coax Feanor into moving forward, and once again Alexios may not have any option but to do so. There's no archers on this side of the field, which is interesting. Marines of Vinyamar are javelins. 2 units of Sons of Hrin is a big investment, but it's a huge amount of damage that's going to be coming the way of Feanor as well. And finally, last but not least, we have the Elves of the Falas, played by Panthan and Barsoom, this time facing off against Tol and Gaurhoth. We've got the Spearmen of Brithombar here on the front line, javelins, basic though they may be. Much of the Tol and Gaurhoth force is not exactly the most resilient anyway. Just in behind, a new unit model for the Seafarers, a regular unit of lighter armor-piercing infantry with those maces. Armor-piercing, is that going to be super useful against Tol and Gaurhoth this time around? Probably not. And considering their own defensive shortcomings, the Seafarers, they probably should only be brought against forces you know are going to be heavily armoured as a sort of supporting tool. They're not really the kind of line infantry that you could hang your hat on. But we'll see how they get on here. The Aran Kialim, on the other hand, much more expensive but also far more effective on the front line. All of Tol and Gaurhoth's armour piercing will be at its best against them. But they themselves have such a quality advantage over pretty much everything that Tol and Gaurhoth have, that they should be just fine. We've got Marines of Brithombar and Eglarest, which once again, more javelins. Marines of Eglarest also spears in melee, which anti-cavalry is going to be important on this side of the field because of the sheer amount of wargs that Tol and Gaurhoth have brought, and indeed they often do bring. Over here we've got the Mariners of Erendil, who are, there's only 19 of them, which is interesting. They've been changed into a bodyguard unit now then. This is where the general is by the looks of it after all. Marines of Eglarest and Seafarers of Brithombar as well. And then I'd assume over here we have a little bit of Cav, perhaps? We're not going to be able to see... Oh no, we are going to be able to see them actually. Lurking in the trees with malicious intent. Champions of Eglarest. You can see here, pretty heavily armoured now actually. So as far as a melee Cav unit goes, kind of similar perhaps to the Gijak Scaras on the other side of the field though, with far more finesse to them. And yeah, several units of champions here. So they are going to be able to contest the horseback fighting, intriguingly enough. Are the Falathrim against all of those wargs? We'll see. Both sides have sort of skimped a little bit in certain areas. Everyone has skimped on their infantry to go for a bit more cavalry and support, other than Fingolfin, who have gone for pretty much an entirely infantry-based force with some artillery. But let's see how things go as we get this show on the road. Slightly longer battle, this one, by pitch battle standards, a 2v2 though, so nearly 14k frames. Mangonel going to get in position. I mean, 2 Mangonel is pretty scary, ultimately. They're going to be able to shower their opposition with damage, and you can see here immediately they're going to start consolidating their forces. The Falathrim moving across, and I think this is probably for the best ultimately, because making the battlefield smaller is more in the interests of Fingolfin and the Falathrim. All of the cavalry that Tol and Gaurhoth and Feanor have needs gaps, it needs space to be able to be truly effective. I'm this far zoomed out because surely it's going to be the artillery that does its business first. And the Mangonel is going after the catapult first and foremost. And they will burn, they won't be destroyed immediately. The catapult did fire over here, but didn't hit anything, unfortunately for them. Ishbuk-Krau's hunters actually do have the ranged advantage as well, because the Falathrim simply haven't brought any archers of their own. It's really interesting that a lot of players seem to be omitting archers entirely. Catapult taking hits. Still, once again, yeah, this artillery has been utterly vanquished. So what do Fingolfin do now? The problem here is, of course, if you move forward as a result of the archers being unopposed and the Mangonels doing their thing, is that the cavalry then has carte blanche to do what it wants. Champions of Eglarest moving forward, but backing out of the charge there. Why bring them forward in the first place, you would ask? And I do not have the answer for you. Last samurai-esque charge, I mean, the idea clearly was to try and take advantage of the fragilities of the Ishbuk-Kras, but I mean, the cavalry was all here. If you weren't prepared to lose that cavalry unit, why bring them forward? Question must be asked. Come on, Panthan, don't make me criticise you the whole game again. It's a really weird situation to be in, though. There's not really a clear-cut choice of what to do, but being this indecisive with your cavalry is certainly not the way to win the battle. Scouts of Britholbar trying to utilise their own ranged unit, or ranged firepower I should say. Ejak Scaraz from the front are reasonably durable, however. They will fancy their chances. Meanwhile, over on this side of things, Herdsman of Dorloman, Arquani Findicano, ooh. Fingolfin General getting domed by artillery. Arquani Findicano retreating. Mountain Company of Himring throwing their javelins into the Herdsman as they move forward. And it is, I mean, Feanor being aggressive in spite of the fact they didn't need to be. After the loss of that Fingolfin artillery is heartening to see, honestly. Marines of Vinyamar should be able to overwhelm these shield bearers, but the problem is the cavalry support around them is pretty substantial. We haven't really seen the Dragon Guard able to use their ammunition either, which I mentioned that was one of the key points. They could be really, really effective. But this is certainly much better from Feanor than we saw last time, because in terms of composition I don't think there was really much to decide between the two. But I think the key factor here may be the fact that Tol and Gaurhoth sniped that artillery out. Fingolfin's artillery peppering Fingolfin and forcing the engagement on their terms, or peppering Feanor and forcing the engagement on Fingolfin's terms, was key to their plans, I think. And ultimately, that's already been compromised. Armatar of Barad-Ithel. And then there's the Roqueni Magloro as well. Sons of Hrin trying to charge. I mean, the Roqueni have taken a few losses, but we saw why. They were trying to pull through some sentries. I mean, here we have the Herdsman of Hithlum. An archer first and foremost, of course, and they're going to be firing away at these units as they approach. But I mean, the Footmen of Himring from the front. Defenders of Aglon in there as well, who must have been hidden previously. Surely they would be better off to go after rather than directly into the shields of the footmen, but I guess at this point just get that damage downrange before the inevitable melee engagement begins. Over yonder, not much happening still between the Falathrim and Tol and Gaurhoth, and that suits Tol and Gaurhoth just fine. The more they can simply batter away at the numbers that the Falathrim have. Grilled. Mangonel has changed a little bit since last we saw it. No longer is it the utterly unpredictable beast it seems that it once was. Marines of Vinyamar getting at least partially surrounded here by the Footmen of Himring. That should be enough to finish them off. I mean, the Marines of Vinyamar are a javelin unit first and foremost, and we didn't get to see them utilise much of their ammunition either. So much of Fingolfin's force, catapults and javelins, not able to use as much of their payload as they would want. Footmen of Himring, initially at the very least, are mace men in melee now instead of axe men, the Herdsmen of Hithlum, but the same thing still applies. Still a bit of armour-piercing edge to them, which along with the pikes, I mean, as long as they are unsupported, the Footmen of Himring should be fine. You can see there the chaotic artillery fire in the background. There's still the small matter of the Sons of Hrin, which Feanor don't necessarily have an easy answer to. Defenders of Aglon against the Dragon Guard would be just fine, but with the Sons of Hrin getting involved in this fight as well, that muddies the waters fairly substantially. Away you go. Sons, I mean, ooh, not a charge that. If that was an intentional charge, that would have been pretty nasty for the Sons, but instead it wasn't, and you can see how quickly there the cavalry started to fall under the axe blows that the Sons of Hrin do have. Over on this flank, things have stabilised a little bit now for Fingolfin. They've managed to bank up some sentries, and the old catapult crew now being used as a line infantry unit, preventing any further advance there. Cavalry trying to impact the battle ever so slightly. The Accursed of Alcolonde wheeling around the back as well. Oof. I mean, the Roqueni have been dealt with fairly nicely. Dragon Guard, and you can see Champions of Aglarest coming over here. Some of them dying, but managing to prevent any further shenanigans from the best that Feanor have to offer. In come the accursed of Alqualonde, going to be going about their work, managing to split the attentions of the pikes, which can be vital, but they're also going to take a charge from the Sons of Hrin, and once again, the accursed of Alqualonde, as strong as they are, may be biting off more than they can chew in a 1-to-1 here. Artillery streaking through the air, and fiery javelins trying to go after the Armatar, who are still just here in close proximity, bolstering this human morale, supporting units, defenders of Aglon moving forwards. And it is a pretty stark contrast in quality. All of these Hithlum units are pretty good for what they are, but going up against a combination of the sword and board and two-handed sword upper end infantry that Feanor have to offer, which individually are some of the most efficient units that their factions have to offer. Once again, still no movement from the Falathrim, but again, I don't really know what the Falathrim want to do. I mean, I think maybe the play would have been to completely join the two armies up, Falathrim and Fingolfin, but I thought that's what they were doing in the opening stages of the battle. That isn't ultimately how it's played out. And I mean, the Falathrim infantry here is going to be very depleted by the time all of these archers have used up all their ammunition. And then what? There's all the champions of Eglarest, I suppose, but I mean, look back over here, I think that's already being heavily dealt with by Gaurhoth, hounding the Falathrim cavalry. There are the Foresters of Nimbrathil over here as well, slightly lighter unit, two-handed spears, sort of thing which can prove to be a problem, but they're going to kite backwards, and this is going to be the story of this battle as it continues. Jack Scaraz over here as well, just going to try and engage the champions perhaps a little bit further away from the support of those spearmen on foot. So if that was intentional, that was a fairly slick move. Kraz continuing to be pressured, however. Meanwhile, herdsmen of Hithlum, clattering charge from the Hunts of Caledon. They need to retreat pretty quickly because it is the Sons of Hrin that they are going after. Further afield, Hunts of Caledon. Otorn Mighty Mo now getting onto the front line just to add a little bit of extra quality, crunching in from the sides. Surely a real problem for these sentries of Hithlum, not exactly what they were built for. Artillery now also starting to have an impact. Although over here, this flank has whittled down a little bit. Again, Alqualonde routing. I think on this occasion, though, against the Sons of Hrin, it's a little bit more understandable, though another disappointing showing from them, considering how devastating they are billed to be. And shield bearers lasting longer than the Accursed. I mean, the Sons of Hrin are really doing some heavy work here in the backfield, and the Dragon Guard, we have seen a few more examples of their throwing projectiles in action. Javelins at fairly point blank against the Hunts of Caledon. It's not going to stop the charge from landing on the Marines of Brithombar. The Falathrim over here. I mean, if Fingolfin do end up winning, it'll give the Falathrim the evidence they need to prove that the way they were approaching things in this battle was the right thing to do. Ooh, hello. That must be the Marines of Brithombar. And this is an example, probably the first example, of a new specialty projectile unit doing an awful lot of damage there. Javelins that sort of have several explosions after the fact. I mean, as much as it looks fairly impressive and induces that god-awful camera shake, how much damage is it doing, realistically? It's looking like a fairly limited amount. Still, Gaurhoth are just sitting there and taking it, so we'll see how that progresses. Hunts of Caledon over here, joining up with their warg brethren on this occasion, champions of Eglarest. Their newfound resplendence with that gold armour, not enough for them to seize the initiative. See one of the mangonel hitting the cliff in the background there. Across comes some Feardsmen of Dorloman. Marines of Brythombar throwing their payload in. Herdsmen of Hithlum still going about their business, so this is a far closer battle than last time. I think the initial phases of the battle, you would say that Feanor and Gaurhoth did pretty damn well, but as the fight has gone on, the Falathrim and Fingolfin have shown their resilience. Of Hrin, Yotor and Mighty Mo as well, as much as they are a very impressive bodyguard tier unit. In the game of rock, paper, scissors, the Sons of Hrin are ideal for dealing with that level of quality, that level of armour at the highest end. They're over here, herdsmen, trying to do their thing. Get into a situation where that armour piercing will be at its most effective. Defenders of Aglon, I mean, to be fair, as much as they have ultimately ended up losing, the human units on the front line over here have lasted a pretty long time against some pretty stark opposition. Defenders of Aglon doing their thing. Spearmen chasing off that Ishbuk unit. So after the damage that both sides took at the hands of one another, who is now going to win over here? Scarahai Blood Drinkers have the armour piercing, but the quality difference between them and the Iran Kielin. Mariners getting into melee as well now. I don't know how strong they are in melee now that they're a much more specialty unit. Marines of Eglarest peeling themselves off the front line. This will also be a pretty stark test of these seafarers of Brythombar. It's not an ideal matchup for them because, again, like I said, they don't really have the opportunity to use the efficiency of those maces. Ishbuk, the hunters as well. Now the mangonel crew getting in and amongst things. I think the numbers that Gaurhoth still have may prove to be a real problem here, especially with how the backfield is compromised. Vorback Gajutar and Gijak Skaraz together. The mangonel crew now also. I think that was always the issue as those archers continue to do their work. So I think the archers ultimately ended up over the long haul being more of a menace. Yeah, the numbers here are going to be too much for the Falathrim to bear. As much as those Mariners looked pretty sensational, not enough in the end to tip the scales back in the Falathrim's favour. And now defenders of Aglon also adding themselves to the mix. All of this cavalry. So a real conundrum to have to try and deal with. I mean, Fingolfin victorious perhaps over here. Still a little bit of the Falathrim army with them as well. Mangonel crew. Once again, I think as an individual infantry unit, the Sons of Hrin have been the most impressive on the field, but that alone is not going to be enough. Ishbukraz Zagula Club. More units arriving to try and isolate and destroy this one unit of Ironshod Legionaries, which is all well and good, but the rest of the field needs those Sons of Hrin. And I don't think they're going to get them, because it's going to be the Sons of Hrin having to do things alone, the two units on them. Everything else starting to rout, the cavalry is going to be too much, and yeah. Rather rapidly this battle has gotten away from the red team, and it is going to be a blue victory. Feanor and Gaurhoth both redeeming themselves after relatively poor showings previous. First time we've seen the Falathrim and Fingolfin. Maybe not the best example of what the Falathrim would usually do. I don't think they played poorly, because I think even if they had moved forward in the face of those archer volleys, it wouldn't have been to their benefit, because then the wargs would have been able to be more effective earlier. It was just, again, a case of blind compositions being picked, and it didn't really work out for the Falathrim. They needed archers, really, and I am surprised that was an omission that they made. If you're not going to bring archers, you need to be prepared to be hyper-aggressive, essentially. You need it to at least be an option that you have, and that wasn't something the Falathrim could do. And that maybe was the problem that Panther and Barsoom ran into here. A couple of heavy archers, and they would have been very comfortable. Ishbuk-Kraz just munching away on those marines. As for Fingolfin, I mean, they were ultimately narrowly victorious over here. But then there's all this cavalry which wasn't killed off outright. Although most of the cavalry is actually wargs. Maybe it just comes down to their artillery being sniped out, because if that hadn't happened, Fingolfin maybe would have been a little bit more domineering against Feanor, and then a starker challenge for Gaurhoth late on. As it is, in terms of their compositions and how they were used, worthy victors Feanor and Gaurhoth on this occasion, I think. It is what it is. Sons of Hrin. Axe to axe against a unit that individually they have a very clear advantage against, and they are going to go down swinging if nothing else. Into the fray. Got the Howlers as well. Gaurhoth certainly healthier than Feanor in the late game, which is probably a sign of where the engagements went. In comes Sauron. Haven't really seen him. He is bloodied. I think that's because when the Falathrim were engaged on the front line, he came marauding in as well. Sons of Hrin actually one of the units which will cause him problems. But yeah, that's another problem. I mean, if Sauron comes forward and you've got a lightweight force like the Falathrim had on their front line, it's not really going to end too well. One unit of Aran Keel in does not make your front line rigid enough. There you go. The composition was picked with certain things in mind, and those didn't really pan out for the Falathrim. As a result of the catapult being destroyed, nor for Fingolfin. Whereas most of the key units for Gaurhoth and Feanor were used pretty damn well. I think the Roqueni were the ones which ultimately ended up bearing the brunt of a lot of damage their way, but other cav units were used pretty damn effectively, I think, as a result. Sauron just barging his own troops out of the way. And there we have it. That is going to be that. And that's it. A worthy victory, I think. The right team certainly won that for all the reasons that I just mentioned. So as far as kills go, I mean, again, Panthan struggled a little bit, I think, which is kind of unfortunate 2 games in a row, but this was far more of an understandable one. Difficult considering the units he decided to bring. Again, I would criticise the decision to bring no archers at all, just because of how it ended up working out. But again, it is what it is. Very even amounts of kills for both Alexios and Tundra's Fox, sharing the load nicely. Captain Gervais did quite well, I think. Again, fair amount of kills, and considering how small the Feanor army was, not too bad, although, again, you'd say with the numbers, problem is, though, the cavalry, if you move forward and be aggressive as Fingolfin in this sort of situation, you can try and envelop the Feanor infantry, but in so doing, you'd leave yourself horribly exposed to the cavalry that Feanor have, so what are you going to do, right? Let's see what did the damage then for Gaurhoth. Yeah, Ishbuk-Kraz hunters getting just shy of 200 kills apiece against an Elven faction. That's always going to be good, and it's always going to be something you can't really allow if you're an Elven faction. The 2 detachment units as well. You know, that's a half strength version of that, and they got less than half the kills, but it is what it is. You know, all free damage essentially. Scarrow High Blood Drinkers 110 as well. So yeah, it was really the archers that did the business, and the cavalry as well, ultimately. Sauron, during the small amount of time he was committed, ended up getting 90 kills also. Mangonel was also key, so it's not really about amount of kills here. The cavalry won the cavalry superiority for their team, and also the Mangonel completely shut down any chance that Fingolfin would have had to try and steer the battle and Feanor's army in the ways they would have wanted. So yeah, like I said, Tundra Fox didn't actually send this one to me. This is one that I harvested from the Silmarillion Discord. Though this one I think far better than the last one, and I think I'm happy with my decision to do 2 of these this week as a result of that last one. By the time this one comes out, incidentally, I think it'll be near enough the time to start thinking about getting the channel update video out the door. And it's going to be an important one this year, I think, for a few reasons. I still haven't got the content of it down exactly, but yeah, there is definitely a few question marks over what's going to be happening next year, and I'll outline all of those in that. I think by this point, yeah, it'll be probably like next week following on from this one, because I want to get it out before Christmas, ideally, and then get everything set up over Christmas and the New Year when I'm visiting family, so that the channel can keep ticking along as it does. So yeah, we'll see on that one. I've got to start penciling everything in a little bit more of a concrete way rather than just replay to replay. But yeah, we'll see. So big thank you to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this.